Well, hey there, Joshua Johnson speaking. It's great to be with you on this Monday, June 27th. And tonight, we're talking about the future of abortion in America. The overturning of Roe v. Wade raises a lot of questions. Can you travel out of state for an abortion? What new laws are in effect? How likely is a nationwide ban, or perhaps nationwide protections? A legal expert answers your questions next. But the Supreme Court's term is not over. Today, it ruled on prayer in public schools. We'll explain. The January 6th committee is promising big revelations tomorrow. A newly announced hearing caught us by surprise. We'll preview what we know and consider who the star witness might be. Also, Russia just suffered an economic blow not seen in more than a century. It's another knock-on effect of the war in Ukraine. And the monkeypox outbreak has more health officials reaching out to gay and bisexual men. But how do you serve this community without stigmatizing it? So America's had the weekend to absorb the Supreme Court ruling on abortion. Reality is setting in, and it seems most Americans are not happy about that. Check out this new poll from NPR, the PBS NewsHour, and Marist. 56% of respondents nationwide said they disagree with the ruling, a majority well outside the margin of error. Now, this poll was taken on Friday and Saturday. The ruling came out Friday. On top of this opposition is uncertainty. After Roe was struck down, 13 states immediately took action on so-called trigger laws. They were written to ban or restrict abortions in the event of such a ruling. But some of these measures are on hold. Today, judges in Louisiana and Utah temporarily blocked trigger laws there. Lawyers for an abortion clinic in Utah say they had 28 women waiting on appointments just today. Today also saw new lawsuits filed in a number of states, including Kentucky, Louisiana, Texas, and Idaho. And there are national questions that remain unanswerable tonight. Can states ban abortion pills if the FDA has approved them? Can companies cover the cost of abortion services for their employees? And what about former Vice President Mike Pence calling for a national ban on abortion? How will that change this whole debate? Like I said, unanswerable, at least for now. But let's get some of the things we can answer with Shakira Sanders. She's a professor at the University of Idaho College of Law. Professor, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
First of all, can we talk about some of these lawsuits against trigger laws? Give me a sense of what the courts in these various states might be considering in terms of whether or not to undo something that a state legislature has enacted, with the caveat that every state's a little bit different. But generally speaking, what might these cases be deliberated over?
Well, what we saw today in both Utah and Louisiana are challenges to such trigger laws that were passed prior to the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Dobbs overturning Roe versus Wade. So in Utah, you had a law that was challenged because it was too narrow. That law said that an abortion is available only where necessary to avoid death or substantial harm. In cases of rape or incest, a doctor must verify and the woman must report. In Louisiana, what we saw was a challenge saying that the law was too vague. It was unclear. And in Louisiana, their trigger law made abortions illegal. No exception for rape or incest. The only exception is for the mother's life. Unclear whether the mother's health qualified.
So the issue, it sounds like, at least in some of these places, is whether or not it is legal under the rest of the state's laws to have a ban that does what it does in terms of the impact, for example, on the mother. It kind of sounds like it's a matter of whether these trigger laws sort of hang together with the totality of the rest of the governing laws in that state. Is that part of it?
For sure. And I would not be too surprised to see both state legislatures return to the courthouse. In the instance of Idaho, it would have to be a special session because it's over the legislative session. But I would not be surprised if these state legislatures and many more had sessions this summer to clarify what their trigger laws are or their abortion regulations overall.
There have been a number of questions in terms of what can be done and were raised by some of the people who were protesting in the cities that we just showed. But in terms of what the federal government can do in terms of protecting abortion access, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was on Meet the Press yesterday, and here's part of what she said. Watch.
We have some ideas coming from Senator Warren, signed a letter along with 25 other Democratic senators asking President Biden to explore opening health care clinics on federal lands in red states in order to help people access the health care and abortion services that they need.
Professor, what's your sense in terms of how much the federal government can actually do in terms of the land and the property that's under the administration's control?
Really unclear. This would be unprecedented. Now, what we do know, if any federal law is passed, it can be challenged in federal court. And it very well may be that it ends up back in front of SCOTUS. Now, whether the federal courts can use the land that they own in a particular state, or whether the federal government can do more providing funding in terms of using its spending power, perhaps that is the right approach. Really unclear what a federal court can do in this particular area on its own federal land. And our previous examples don't really show that this has been done before.
There's also a lot of anger over the justices who did vote to overturn Roe v. Wade, particularly considering the way that some of them testified when they were confirmed about Roe v. Wade being a precedent that did not need to be revisited. You had Senators Joe Manchin and Susan Collins in particular saying that they were kind of shocked at the way that this turned out. That feels a little credulous to me. But then Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez went another step further and said that that might be grounds for impeachment, trying to accuse them basically of lying to the Senate to get the job on the Supreme Court. I'm not sure where that goes. I don't know that we've ever impeached and removed an Associate Justice of the United States, but how do you see it?
I think it would be very difficult to bring charges of perjury for their testimony. It very well could be that for all of those judicial candidates, that at the time they believed Roe versus Wade to be precedent. But that does not mean that they agree that the case should remain the law. And the rule is, when it comes to the Supreme Court, all you need are 5 justices. And therefore, there is no law that can't be overturned, or no case that cannot be reassessed.
And before I have to let you go, Justice Thomas scared a number of people with his concurring opinion and talking about other cases that had to do with substantive due process possibly being revisited and overturned, like Griswold and Eisenstadt, which deal with contraception, Obergefell, which deals with same-sex marriage, Lawrence v. Texas, which deals with same-sex private consensual sexual activity. What is your sense, before I have to let you go, what is your sense of the future of those precedents? It sounds like the case would need to be brought before the court, and they'd have to agree to grant it certiorari, agree to hear it before that could happen, but that's not an impossibility. But how do you see it before we go?
Well, one thing, this came from Justice Thomas's concurring opinion. So it wasn't a piece of opinion that other judges sort of voted in favor, but he did seem to indicate that he did not believe substantive due process was a protected of rights that are not announced in the Constitution or unenumerated rights. Now, for some time, he has advocated the 14th Amendment's Privileges and Immunities Clause as the protector of rights that are not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. But let's make clear that portion of his concurring opinion was curious, given he names same-sex marriage, but not opposite-sex marriage, and the foundations of marriage in general do lie in substantive due process. So it's a little unclear if he forgot to mention marriage in general, or if somehow he's singling out same-sex marriage. We're going to have to wait and see.
And a number of people brought up also Loving versus Virginia in '67, which lifted laws banning interracial marriage, and his wife, Virginia Thomas, is white. So that was another issue that came up with all this. Lots of tough questions to answer, but I appreciate you talking us through some of them tonight. Law Professor Shakira Sanders of the University of Idaho, thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the January 6th committee made an unexpected announcement today. It will hold a hearing tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern on Capitol Hill. We'll have coverage of that here on NBC News Now. A statement from the committee says that it will, quote, present recently obtained evidence and receive witness testimony, unquote. The witness's name has not been released, and it's unclear what new evidence they will show. The committee previously said the next hearing would take place after the July 4th break, but tomorrow's last-minute proceedings are due to, quote, time-sensitive information. Let's head now to Capitol Hill, where NBC's Julie Serkin is standing by. And Julie, off the top, what, if anything, do we know for sure about this hearing other than the time and the place?
Well, not much, Josh. They're keeping the witness a secret for now. This is very different than the way the last 5 hearings were laid out. Of course, we got notice of them at least a couple days before, and we had topics, subjects, witnesses, surely at least a night before the hearings. Tomorrow, other than the fact that it's at 1 p.m., we don't know much else. Now, the committee obviously has something very pressing they need to present. Otherwise, they would have not done this hearing on a week where we have a holiday at the end, July 4th. It's well underway, the recess for all House members and the Senate, of course, by the way. So other than that, we really don't know much.
They had pushed back some of the hearings because they said there was such immense demand on the staff to just go through the evidence they have, particularly all the video. Those of us who work in TV know how much energy it takes to go through all that video, cut sound bites, put it together, get it organized. So I understand why they pushed it back. But this has also got to kind of shift the workload, too, considering there's this new hearing to be thrown in the mix.
Well, look, we know the committee is constantly interviewing new witnesses. They're always a work in progress, collecting new evidence. They clearly haven't put their pens down despite entering this public phase of their investigation. We also know, like I mentioned, the last 5 hearings, of course, had a clear theme. They focused, one of them on former Vice President Mike Pence, on the efforts to subvert the election by Donald Trump and his allies, the pressure campaign that they put on local election officials and the Department of Justice. So we know tomorrow's hearing is not in place of any hearings they're going to have in July. It's just in addition to, and like they said in their statement, they have pressing new evidence. They have a deal with a witness, perhaps somebody that they've already heard from behind closed doors or somebody new. There's Alex Holder, of course. We know they postponed last week's hearings because they said they need more time to look over hours of documentary footage from him. We know Pat Cipollone is another name they want to hear from publicly. Obviously, we don't know if either of those will be the one we'll hear from tomorrow, but we'll just have to wait and see.
And do we have any more sense of what those last hearings are going to look like, or whatever other pieces of this whole puzzle the committee still needs to lay out, at least in terms of what we're expecting them to lay out?
Yeah, well, like I mentioned, they're a continuous work in progress, but we did hear from Adam Schiff, who's a member of the Select Committee. Let's take a listen to what he told Chuck Todd.
Well, the next couple of hearings will cover the run-up to January 6th, the marshaling of this mob that appeared on the mall that day and attacked the Capitol. And then the final hearing will cover what the president was doing and, more importantly, what he was not doing as we were being attacked.
In those hours on January 6th itself.
Exactly. Yeah. Basically, the president's flagrant dereliction of duty while the Capitol was being attacked.
So listen, they're going to continue building on this evidence. Like I said, tomorrow's hearing is not in place of what the committee is already planning on laying out in the coming weeks. But we'll just have to see if they continue to add more hearings, if they perhaps have new witnesses that decide to come forward, because they're still continuing this investigation.
Got it. Thank you, Julie. That's NBC's Julie Serkin reporting for us tonight on Capitol Hill. And remember, you can join us for coverage of that hearing tomorrow. It's at 1 p.m. Eastern here on NBC News Now. Amtrak is investigating a deadly crash for the second time in 2 days. Today, a train from Los Angeles to Chicago derailed in northern Missouri. More than 240 people were aboard, and officials say many people are injured and at least 3 have died. NBC's Jesse Kirsch is here with the latest. Hey, Jesse.
Joshua, so here's what we know at this point. This was the Southwest Chief. It was going from California to Chicago when this derailment happened in Missouri, about 100+ miles from Kansas City, Missouri. Authorities say that there were 250 people on board this train. It collided with a dump truck at what is called an uncontrolled crossing. So think about an area where you don't have the gate going up and down. You don't have the flashing lights. So this collision happens, and police say that 7 cars from this train derailed. And we now know from police that 3 people are dead, 2 who were on the train and 1 person who was in the dump truck. Now, one of the more chilling things that we have learned in the hours that have followed since is that we know there was over a dozen Boy Scouts on this train, and that is significant because the Boy Scouts of America is telling NBC News that one of the Boy Scouts, a 15-year-old boy, was found the driver of this pickup truck, of this dump truck, was consoling this person in the ditch until they passed away. So this was certainly a traumatic experience for that teenager, not to mention the 200+ people who were on board that train. We know that the NTSB is sending an investigative team, so federal authorities are making their way to the scene of this crash. And one other thing that stood out to me from the briefing we got from authorities, Joshua, is that the 911 call came in around 12:43 p.m. It took until after 1 p.m. for first responders to get there. So, of course, that's something we'll be keeping an eye on, is how long that first responder timeline was. Now that might have impacted if any lives could have been saved.
We mentioned that this was the second fatal derailment, fatal crash in 2 days. Is there any early sense of whether these 2 crashes have anything in common, any similarities?
So we know they were both have been deadly. However, the other incident did not involve a derailment. And we know in this incident, 2 of the people who died were on the train, and that the train cars were derailing in this incident. The other, there was no derailment. A car was collided, or was hit by the train, and people unfortunately passed away in that incident as well. But there was a deadly derailment with Amtrak back in September in Montana. And so obviously this is another high-profile incident for Amtrak. And again, they're investigating, federal authorities are investigating, and obviously there's some families that are going to have some serious questions tonight.
And I'm guessing we don't know much more about the dump truck driver other than that horrible detail about a Boy Scout consoling him in his last moments alive. But we don't know whether the driver was inebriated or distracted, or we just don't know yet.
No, we don't have anything on that. We don't have any information on the victims at this point. But, you know, again, this was an uncontrolled crossing. So this isn't somewhere where you would have that warning gate, but obviously there are going to be questions because it's hard to not see a train coming.
Right, yeah, wow. Thank you, Jesse. That's NBC's Jesse Kirsch with the latest for us tonight. Still to come, 2 perspectives on the future of abortion. One from a doctor who performs so-called late-term abortions, and one from a woman whose own abortion made her speak out against them. We're glad you're with us for Now Tonight from NBC News. When the Supreme Court ruled on abortion, an array of state restrictions and bans kicked in. That both clarified many laws and complicated many lives. Clinics in states with abortion protections say they are bracing for a lot of new patients. Those are the states on the map in green. One Colorado doctor we introduced you to has already seen the impact of this. Dr. Warren Hearn specializes in so-called late-term abortions. He says that in the last year, his out-of-state patient load has doubled. Dr. Hearn and a patient who traveled cross-country for his care spoke to NBC's Isa Gutierrez.
This layer here is bulletproof, okay?
Nearly half a century ago, Dr. Warren Hearn worked at Colorado's very first abortion clinic. A controversial practice then and now, with the Supreme Court overturning their landmark 1973 decision, Roe v. Wade.
All the windows around here are bulletproof.
2 years later, he founded this place, the Boulder Abortion Clinic, in 1975.
We specialize in taking care of women who have very high-risk situations that can't be seen in other clinics.
He's one of a handful of doctors in the U.S. who perform late-term abortions. Colorado, one of only a few states that does not restrict them. According to CDC data, abortions at or after 21 weeks represent less than 1% of all abortions in the U.S. In 2019, they say more than 4,800 were performed. Last year, a jump in abortion restrictions enacted in 19 states, with conservative legislators arguing life begins at conception. These days, Dr. Hearn says abortion bans like the ones in Texas and Oklahoma restricting abortion after cardiac activity at 6 weeks are making his practice exceptionally busy.
The number of patients we've seen has basically doubled since a year ago. We can't possibly see all the women who want to come here for help. And I need to expand my service.
He says the Supreme Court's decision will push more women to have late-term abortions.
That increases the cost, it increases the complexity, it makes it more difficult, it takes more time, it's more emotional anguish.
Erica Christensen, a former patient of Dr. Hearn, was in her 3rd trimester when she says her doctor explained her baby wasn't swallowing.
There was a genetic muscular condition that would not be conducive to living outside my body.
She says they decided to terminate the pregnancy.
That's when we learned that we couldn't in our state because we had crossed an imaginary line that we didn't even know existed until that point. We were sort of shocked by that because we were living in New York.
It was 2016, and at the time, state law banned abortions after 24 weeks. She was referred to Dr. Hearn's clinic in Colorado.
It took 2 weeks for us, under the best possible circumstances, to figure out my course of care.
Ultimately, she says she was lucky.
It's poor people, it's young people, it is disabled people, medically complex people like myself, it is people of color. These are the people who are going to be most impacted by these bans. Most people are just not as lucky as I was.
Less than a year after visiting Dr. Hearn, Erica gave birth to a daughter.
My 5-year-old little girl literally would not be here had I not been able to have my abortion. She's everything to us, like she's our whole lives.
Do you think about these laws changing and how they'll impact her potentially one day?
Every day. I think about what life is going to be like for my 5-year-old little girl every day. I hope that by the time she's even thinking about becoming pregnant, I hope things are better. But certainly, I mean, it's really scary times. Like, I'm absolutely terrified for her.
Do you already have plans for the new building?
I'm working on it, yeah. I'm sketching out plans. I'm working with the architects. I want us to be able to see more patients.
Dr. Hearn is turning 84 this month.
You're not going to retire?
No, I don't have time for that. I'm bringing other young physicians to help me, and they're very dedicated and very skilled.
That was NBC's Isa Gutierrez reporting. Now, Dr. Hearn has been advocating abortion access for decades. Meanwhile, many activists have been fighting abortion access almost as long. Some have very personal reasons for doing so. Let's continue now with Olivia Gans-Turner. She's the director of the anti-abortion group American Victims of Abortion. Ms. Turner, welcome. Good to have you with us.
It's great to be able to join you on this very serious subject. It's important for us to talk about these things.
I'm interested, first of all, in how this has affected you. You said that you became an activist after having an abortion that you said you felt somewhat pressured into without having all of the facts to make your own decision. Is that right?
I've been involved in the movement for quite some time. It is true. I was involved in the movement since 1 year after my own abortion experience in 1981. I joined the movement in 1982 after attending a National Right to Life convention where I actually heard Dr. Vincent Rue speak about the realities that he was seeing in his practice of the psychological and emotional damage that women were expressing in his clinical work. And I've worked since that time to share and work with other women like myself to talk about what we remember from our abortion experiences. I remember being told that I was immature, selfish, unrealistic, and unable to think clearly because I was pregnant, and that perhaps I should do what my baby's father thought was important. So after feeling that sense of not being heard and being belittled and being unimportant in the process in that way, I really realized that perhaps I wasn't the only one. And as it's turned out, I've spoken in all 50 states and over 17 countries abroad. And I've heard stories like my own again and again and again. And I absolutely do not criticize any woman who's had an abortion. I've walked a walk with those women. I understand their stories. But what I'm saying and what I'm hoping for and what I've worked in the pro-life movement at National Right to Life and with American Victims to do is to challenge our nation to do better, to do more for women, to recognize that it's not necessarily being pregnant that is the problem. but we often completely ignore the social circumstances or personal circumstances that make being pregnant a problem or complicated.
It sounds kind of
I want
like
us to see.
it sounds kind of like you were shamed around your experience of abortion. I feel like maybe there's a common conversation that needs to be had, perhaps, just from what you're telling me, about the nature of the way that we talk to women in general, but I can see that conversation sort of going in a number of directions. Women with all the information, as you put it, could choose to have an abortion, could choose not to have an abortion, but I feel like the shame is the real issue rather than the procedure itself. I'm just trying to understand.
I don't know that necessarily shame, but I do think isolation and a sense of not having the support that a woman really wants, deserves, or needs at the time of her making a decision about a pregnancy is truly what complicates these stories. Recently, all these discussions because of the leaked draft and now the ruling, we're seeing a kind of social triggering. We've seen abortion that's been legal for so many decades, and yet we still live in a society that is unwilling or unable or uninterested in providing the kind of supports that women need. Childcare in the workplace, opportunities for at-home work for women who might be able to stay at home. Heavens to Betsy, it's 2022. We've learned how to work from home. We also are not seeing the kind of support services that we often need to make sure that women have access to education and they're not blocked from it, or even perhaps even losing their jobs because of their pregnancies. All of these things seem archaic and seem like something out of the Victorian era. And it's time, perhaps, with this new ruling from the Supreme Court, to ask those hard questions. I agree. It's time for a conversation about why do women still believe, in some cases, that the only option they may have is an abortion. The reality is that I've worked for decades with women who are coming together and creating networks of support that go far beyond the pregnancy and actually address the situations that real women face every day. Women who are in minority populations, vulnerable populations, women who are older, women who are younger. There are things we're not even talking about because for decades now, we have said, gee, it's a complicated situation. The best thing we can offer her is an abortion. That's a failure. That's been a failure since 1973. And it's something it's time for all Americans in all 50 states to address, to challenge our institutions to meet the mark.
Well, with regard to the situation that women find themselves in once they become pregnant, I think I hear you in terms of the need to provide more holistic family planning options, right, for women and particularly working women. I think there are lots of people of many political backgrounds who would agree with you. Well, I think there are lots of people from a variety of political backgrounds who would agree with you on that. But inside of that, I think there are some other questions about how we deal with all those other options. We did get a question from one of our viewers, Janet in Kansas, who asked something I thought was pretty cogent, and I'd love you to respond to Janet's question. Here's what she left in our inbox. Listen.
Who is going to pay all the bills for Medicaid for all those poor women who are going to now either have medical problems with the abortion, with not having an abortion, or have all those children who are going to have medical problems because they were not taken care of well in the womb because their parents didn't have the money.
Janet, thank you for sharing that question with us. I know I have to let you go in just a second, Ms. Turner, but I think part of where we go from here is how to care for the women who are now in situations where abortion services are no longer available, and they now have to figure out how, economically and in every other way, to support another young life. What would you say to Janet before we go?
Well, I would say that Janet may not realize that for many, many years now, the pro-life movement has been creating a network, an incredible network of pregnancy resource systems that actually provide services free of charge to any pregnant individual, regardless of their circumstances, for as long as that woman needs the help and assistance. Help that includes housing, medical care, educational opportunities, childcare options, services that are often not thought about. And all of this is done free of charge. The state that I live in, Virginia, has over 40 of these pregnancy resource programs. They vary in their service levels, they vary in their connections, but they're all dedicated to one thing: to recognizing that there are women in financial crisis and there are women who have health services that they're lacking. And these are services that we can provide. So at Nationalized
Well, those services have to stop at a certain point. I mean, you're not going to be able to.
That will expand.
I mean, those services have to. Forgive me, Ms. Turner, but I think those services are going to have to stop at a certain point. I mean, the kids got to be cared for until they're like 18 years old. I think that's kind of what Janet's asking about, is the longer-term care.
It's a really good point you're making, but let's be realistic. If you help a woman get into a state of life with her pregnancy, when it's complicated, when things are an obstacle course, and you give her the tools and the opportunity to live her life with dignity and protect her unborn child from the violence of abortion, you're actually helping her live her life. She doesn't need you in her life till her child is 18 if you establish a criteria that says being pregnant isn't necessarily the problem, but the circumstances around your pregnancy are something we have to address because you deserve it. You are a person we must respect. And as a result, we respect you and your child. And if you give people a foundation, and that's what these programs do, you might be with that mother for 2 or 3 years. You might see her coming back and forth for a period of time, looking for different levels of help or guidance. But at a certain point, the goal is to help every individual who's facing a complicated pregnancy realize that there's a better answer than paying somebody like Dr. Carhart or Dr. Hearn to kill her child. Even in a complicated situation, there are new medical programs like perinatal hospice that really provide answers that are holistic and protective in nature for mothers and their unborn children. And that's what we're not talking about. And that's where we have to go. We can certainly ask our politicians to provide more funding and awareness for programs like the ones I've just mentioned. But all of that together is how we address this as a culture. That's what I'm hoping for.
I hear you in part. I think it's not so much 2 to 3. I mean, my mother took care of me until I was 18. So it's kind of the rest of the timeline that is the problem. But I appreciate you coming on and explaining where you come from on this and why. I'm glad to have heard your backstory. Olivia Gans Turner, thank you so much for making time for us tonight. We appreciate it.
Glad to have been with you.
We will get to some of today's other top stories in just a moment, including a new Supreme Court ruling on prayer in schools, a bipartisan gun violence prevention bill that is now law, and an update on a Russian missile that hit a crowded shopping center in Ukraine. Tonight's headlines begin at the Supreme Court again. Today, it ruled on a case of prayer in public schools in favor of a former football coach. Joseph Kennedy argued that his district violated his religious freedom. It told him not to pray on the field after games. Justices ruled 6-3 in favor of the coach. Here's NBC Justice correspondent Pete Williams.
This ruling is a victory for a former assistant football coach at a high school in Bremerton, Washington, Joseph Kennedy, who made a practice of praying very visibly on the 50-yard line immediately after games. The school district told him, find someplace else to pray more privately to avoid the appearance that the school was involved, which would violate the Constitution's ban on government endorsement of religion. But by a vote of 6-3, the Supreme Court said the school was wrong. Even though the coach was still in uniform and some team members were still on the field, the court said he was acting in a private capacity and was therefore protected by freedom of expression and freedom of religion. The court said he was not performing his official duties once the game ended. The court's 3 dissenters said his praying was anything but private and risked coercing students into joining him. But in writing the majority opinion, Justice Neil Gorsuch said the coach's prayers were not publicly broadcast or recited to a captive audience, and that students were not required or expected to participate. So because the decision hinges on the court's conclusion that he was not performing his official duties at the time he dropped to one knee and prayed, this decision does not appear to open the door to prayer in the classroom, because that would involve a teacher who was engaged in the duty of teaching. But it is another example of the court lowering the wall of separation between church and state. Just last week, the court said that states cannot exclude schools that offer explicitly religious education from a tuition program that uses taxpayer money. Back to you.
Thank you, Pete. That's NBC's Pete Williams with the latest from the Supreme Court today. Now, that ruling on abortion divided Americans just as we had achieved a rare bipartisan effort to reduce gun violence. On Saturday morning, President Biden signed the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. Among other things, this new law enhances background checks for younger gun buyers. It provides grants to states for red flag laws, funds school safety and mental health programs, and addresses gun violence in intimate relationships. That's known as the boyfriend loophole. And that was a major sticking point for Democratic negotiators. Here's what the president said after signing the bill.
While this bill doesn't do everything I want, it does include actions I've long called for that are going to save lives.
This bill passed the Senate on Thursday and the House on Friday. It does not ban assault-style weapons like the guns used in the recent shootings in Buffalo, New York, and Uvalde, Texas. But President Biden says this bill proves that Democrats and Republicans can find common ground on big issues. Right now, Mr. Biden is in Germany for the G7 summit. World leaders are discussing new ways to help Ukraine in its war with Russia. The G7 is vowing to support Ukraine for, quote, as long as it takes. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky met with the group's leaders virtually. He thanked them for their defense and financial assistance. Meanwhile, the Russian assault on key Ukrainian cities has not slowed down. Just hours before the summit began yesterday, an airstrike hit a busy shopping center in central Ukraine. NBC's Ellison Barber has more.
This afternoon, at least 2 rockets hit a shopping center in central eastern Ukraine. At least 1,000 people were reportedly inside the shopping center as the walls began to collapse around them and the building was engulfed in flames. Right now, officials say at least 10 people are dead, 40 people injured, and search and rescue efforts are still underway, so it's very possible that number could increase. President Zelensky says there was no military or strategic reason for this shopping center to be struck. He says there were people inside who were, in his words, just trying to live a normal life. This is an area that was hit by Russian missiles in May and June. They targeted an oil refinery in the area, the largest oil producer in Ukraine, and to this day that oil refinery is still inoperable. But this area had not seen heavy strikes in quite a while now until things changed today. Again, the rescue efforts, they're still underway into the evening hours. We are waiting to get more information and see whether or not these numbers increase as we go into the overnight hours here in Ukraine. The afternoon strike we saw today came on the heels of a number of missile strikes that took place in Kyiv this weekend, including one that hit a residential apartment building and left 1 person dead, injuring 4 others. Back to you.
Thank you, Ellison. That's NBC's Ellison Barber reporting from Kyiv. Now, the sanctions from this war are hurting the Russian economy in a rare way. We'll explain what its current status means for Russia and for the war. And later, we'll get into the latest outreach efforts around monkeypox. It's all about keeping gay and bisexual men safe this summer. For the first time in over 100 years, meaning since roughly the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian government appears to have defaulted on its foreign debt. The reason has to do with its war in Ukraine. The Russian government was supposed to pay $100 million in interest payments for 2 foreign bonds. They were due on May 27th, and the Kremlin got a grace period to pay. Vladimir Putin's government denies the country is sliding into default. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Russia made the payments a month ago, but he claims that a Belgium-based financial services company blocked the payments because of the sanctions. Essentially, he's saying this isn't Russia's fault. Joining us now is Caleb Silver, editor-in-chief of Investopedia. Mr. Silver, good to see you again. Welcome back.
Good to be with you, as always.
Why do I care what happens to the Russian economy with regard to foreign debts? What difference does all this make?
Well, you have to remember the fact that Russia is the world's largest exporter of oil and gas. It supplies about 10 to 11% of global supplies. Now, the U.S. is not buying oil from Russia. Europe still is, though. China still is. They're generating a lot of income there. That said, Russia also has a lot of outstanding debt out there. I think over $640 billion in debt. And that is owned by banks here in the U.S., foreign governments, multinational corporations. So if they default on their debt, if Russia defaults on its debt, then those bondholders are going to be insolvent. They're going to lose their money on that. We're not talking about a tremendous amount of money that might tip the world into another financial crisis, but it's still a lot of money that could unsettle the global banking system. And right now, the global banking system is in a very precarious place as we're looking at a potential recession around the world this year or next.
Forgive me, Kayla, I'm just looking at our screen that says what a loan default is. And in the back of my head, I'm like, I know exactly what a loan default is. Buy me a drink and I'll tell you some of my stories. But with regard to me, it's very different from Russia, right? Because I know what happened to me in my youth and inexperience when I defaulted on a loan and had to figure out a way to kind of get myself right side up again. It's a nightmare. But I think part of what you're saying is this isn't like an individual defaulting on a loan, right? It's all of the various international tendrils of finance and economy and the way we're all so interconnected now that it can kind of pull one thread and make something else unravel real fast. That sounds kind of like what you're saying.
Yeah, we're talking about one of the biggest global economies out there potentially defaulting on its debt, which again is held by other foreign governments and banks. The other thing is when you defaulted on your debt, if you didn't pay your credit cards, you could always pay it back over time because the credit card company or the bank would accept your money. Western banks, mostly Western banks, are not accepting Russian money right now. Russia is excluded from the Western banking system. It's excluded from the SWIFT payment system, which is how banks transfer money from one to the other. Russia has said it has plenty of money and has made or tried to make these payments in rubles. That's not what its debt holders want. Its debt holders want dollars, euro bonds, or potentially gold.
So this is kind of revealing, I think, for people like me who don't follow international economics that much, just how, I mean, is the right word beholden, maybe, that the Russian economy is to Western economies? Vladimir Putin has been talking a real tough game in terms of what he can do with oil exports and cutting certain nations off and making it more expensive. But this almost makes it feel like the West, that like Russia needs the West much more than the West needs Russia, and has really intense leverage that I think it's trying to exert to try to make the war in Ukraine stop.
That is what the West would like you to believe. Russia says it's doing just fine on its own. But take a look, Josh, inside Russia's economy. They're looking at interest rates at about 20%. We're worried about interest rates here at around 3%, 2.5% right now. It's 20% over there. Inflation is at a 14% level there. On the other hand, the value of the ruble is one of the strongest currencies on the planet right now. That continues to increase. Why? The sale of fossil fuels. Russia has sold $98 billion worth of oil and gas in the first 100 days of its invasion of Ukraine. If you think that's slowing down, you're wrong. So Russia has plenty of reserves, plenty of money. All the banks that do have Russian debt and those that are in the United States have written off that debt, and it's not that much on their hands. On the other hand, Russia's foreign debt, most of it in Eurobonds, is what we call distressed. It's at distressed levels, extremely risky, and investors don't want to buy it. So the problem for Russia is that if investors don't want to buy its bonds going forward, then it has no way of borrowing money from international governments, from the International Monetary Fund, from other banks or sovereign institutions, because it's too risky. That's the risk for Russia. On the other hand, they're making plenty of money from oil and gas still to this day.
Before I let you go, my concern is always when you back someone in a corner that they'll do something desperate. And I'm sure there are other nations around the world who are, say, less scrupulous than the nations who use the SWIFT banking system who'll be like, I'll give you some money. It's going to cost you, but I'll be happy to give you some money. And there are people that I don't think Western economies would want Russia doing business with. How much of a concern is there of Russia looking to less scrupulous players to pay off their debts? Or do we just expect this all to kind of work itself out?
No, there are plenty of countries that are still doing business with Russia, still willing to do business with Russia, and as long as they are the biggest exporter of oil and gas, we'll always do business with Russia. So I wouldn't worry about that for Russia's sake, on the one hand. On the other hand, we're talking about a major government here that could face another default on its debt, and if bondholders don't want to buy its debt, that could be a very big problem for Russia and its allies going forward over the next few years. In terms of missing these debt payments and the interest payments on this debt, not a big deal. This is going to be in court for the next 3 years. The debt holders can form an accelerated demand to get Russia to pay right away. But this is going to be locked up in court for years, and Russia's already developing a digital currency to pay some of its other bills. So they're going to find a way around this.
Russia's digital currency. That is a whole other conversation that we have to have you back for some other day. Caleb Silver of Investopedia, always good to see you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
It was a busy Pride weekend in many cities, including this one, and sometimes a troubled one. We'll have an update on the push to protect gay and bisexual men from monkeypox and the latest on a deadly attack in Norway. Before we go. LGBTQ Pride Month is almost over, but the community has plenty of concerns around the world. In Norway, that includes a possible terror attack. Hours before the city of Oslo was about to start its Pride parade, a man opened fire outside a popular gay club. Authorities say he killed 2 people and injured at least 19 others. Prosecutors charged a Norwegian citizen originally from Iran with murder, attempted murder, and terrorism. So far, police say he is refusing to cooperate. Officials have also raised the country's terrorism threat alert to its highest level. The parade and the rest of Norway's Pride celebrations have been canceled. It had been scheduled to end today. Pride celebrations often include outreach for HIV prevention. This year, in some major cities, there's been another disease to worry about: monkeypox. Doctors have found a number of cases in men who have sex with men. According to the CDC, there are more than 240 confirmed cases in the U.S. We've shown you some of the states where it's confirmed here on the map. There have also been more than 4,000 cases reported in roughly 50 countries. Now, to be clear, anyone can get monkeypox. The virus is similar to smallpox, but it can be spread through close contact. And, for whatever reason, a number of the patients are gay and bisexual men. Joining us now is Jason Cianciotto. He's the Vice President of Communications and Public Policy at GMHC, the group formerly known as the Gay Men's Health Crisis. GMHC was founded back in 1982, early in the AIDS crisis. Mr. Cianciotto, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Talk about some of the conversations that have gone on in your organization since this nexus between monkeypox cases and men who have sex with men began. I'm assuming that because of the organization GMHC is, it immediately raised some red flags in terms of the way that we talk about this outbreak.
Absolutely. GMHC was founded in 1982 as the world's first HIV and AIDS services organization, and we're commemorating our 40th year. So we know what can happen when the government and public health agencies don't respond the right way when a virus or an illness happens to outbreak in a particular community. And fortunately, that isn't happening now, 40 years later. You know, the most important message that we want to get across to everybody is to be aware, but don't panic. Be aware about monkeypox, but don't panic about it. And to help people be aware about it, we've created a page on our website at gmhc.org/monkeypox, where people can go to access public health information from the CDC, the New York City Department of Health, and even access the New York City Department of Health's new service to sign up for a vaccination appointment.
We should be clear, there are a number of cases. The number of cases is growing. For example, in New York, as of today, the city says that 48 people have tested positive for the orthopox virus, which is presumed to be monkeypox. That's a significant increase in the last few days, but it's still fewer than 50 people. So it's not like this has run rampant through the community. But I wonder what we do in terms of just the timing. I mean, summer and fall have a lot of events that cater to gay men. I'm looking forward to going to Provincetown next month. And we know that there are a lot of guys who go to these events, whether like me with my boyfriend or people who go single, who are going to meet up, to hook up, to connect. Maybe they come from communities where they positively cannot do that where they live. And so these events are kind of like a lifeline for them. How do we balance that as a community, this need to keep one another safe with the understanding that these events are about a very human need?
We balanced that very much the same way we did with COVID-19. Now, monkeypox is a very different virus from COVID-19, but still what we're encouraging people to do is if that they don't feel well, if they develop flu-like symptoms, if they develop a rash, particularly on the palms of their hands or the soles of their feet, a fever, that they stay inside and that they seek medical attention. That's not just the right thing to do, it's the best thing to do public health. So absolutely, go to Provincetown enjoy the summer, enjoy being with friends, enjoy being with the community. That is such a critical part of our overall health and well-being. But also be aware that monkeypox is out there. And if you don't feel well, stay inside until you can talk to your doctor about it.
I can't let you go without asking you your thoughts on the deployment of vaccines, at least in some places. The UK had begun offering vaccines to men who have sex with men about a week and a half ago, I think. New York City is now offering them as well. What do you make of the vaccine deployment so far and its availability?
This has been a really big problem, both in New York City and the United States. The United States has a stockpile of vaccines that are actually kept in response to potential terrorism. Yet last week, only about 1,000 vaccinations were sent to New York City, and they were all used up in just about 3 hours. And we do not yet know when more vaccines will be made available. So we're calling on the CDC, city and state departments of health to really scale up and speed up their deployment of both commercial testing for monkeypox as well as vaccinations. Our community is very used to being aware and engaged in their public health. People were lining up to get the vaccine. We need to make sure that it's available to them. And we also need to make sure that it is made available to communities who might not have ready access to the healthcare system. You know, just as was the case for HIV and COVID-19, we're concerned that monkeypox could concentrate among lower income communities who don't have ready access to healthcare, who may not trust the healthcare system because of immigration status. And we need to activate community-based organizations like GMHC who have long ties to these communities to make sure that they get vaccines. And I should say that New York City's health clinics are ready and available to test regardless of immigration status.
Jason Cianciato of GMHC, good to have you on tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you for making time for us. Remember, we'll have live special coverage of this unexpected January 6th hearing. That's tomorrow at 1 p.m. Eastern here on NBC News Now. Watch the hearing along with us, and please do send us your questions and reactions to the hearing. You can also write to us about anything you've seen covered on our show tonight. We are at NBC Now Tonight on social media. Leave us a brief but brilliant voicemail, 888-575-2NBC. That's 888-575-2622. Or email us nowtonight@nbcnews.com. Until we meet again, I'm Joshua Johnson. Join us for the hearing at 1 Eastern, and join us again here tomorrow. Good night.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.